Hey everyone, I'm back. Thank you for your patience while I've been gone. I really needed that break, but now I'm here and ready to get stuck back into the pile. And since it's Halloween, to celebrate this channel's return to the land of the living, I thought I'd take a look at another collection of horror stories. Last year I read through the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft, and everyone seemed to enjoy that. So today we're going to read through some of the best weird tales of the writers he inspired in the Book of Cthulhu, published in 2011 and edited by Ross E. Lockhart. Now, H.P. Lovecraft could be a great writer. I'm still thinking about The Colour Out of Space over a year after reading it, but his worldview was undeniably narrow and pretty offensive, even by the standards of the 1920s. I went into the Book of Cthulhu hoping to find stories written from the perspective of and by the people Lovecraft himself never really gave much thought to in his own writings, beyond using them as villains, such as women, people of colour, queer people, and I'm happy to report that I found what I was looking for. But more than anything, I went into these stories hoping to be scared. Fiction rarely frightens me anymore, and books probably do so least of all, because there's no visual or interactive element to react to as there are in movies or video games. Lovecraft came up with some horrifying concepts, but his refusal to describe most of his monsters was frustrating to no end. You can definitely go too far in the other direction. Neonomicon by Alan Moore is proof enough of that, but I think there's a balance to be found and a sweet spot to hit that makes things just visible enough to scare you, but not described enough to ruin their mystique. The stories in the Book of Cthulhu swing like a pendulum in that regard, but when they get the balance right, they get it really right. I talked a little at the end of the previous Halloween video that as horrible a person he was, Lovecraft at least opened the door to cosmic horror for whole generations of writers who followed him. So let's take a look at what they wrote. One last thing before we start though, I'm very open about my dislike of short stories as an art form. So many that I've read either feel like chapters of books that were never finished, or ideas too big to do justice in such a brief word count. There are exceptions of course, many of Lovecraft's own stories among them, but for the most part I do not enjoy shorts. So just keep that in mind if I say to toss your favourite story in the bin. Also, you might notice this video is structured a little differently from how I used to do things on this channel. I'll go into detail a bit more about that at the end of the video, so stick around if you're curious. But for now, consider this the start of Season 2 for Monotone Reads. I hope you enjoy. Let's get to it. The first story in the collection is Andromeda Among the Stones by Caitlin R. Kiernan, and it was decent. It's the story of the Dandridge family and the strange, unearthly secrets hidden beneath their home on the onset of World War I. One of the things that really stood out to me about this story is its connection to history. I really enjoy it when authors from the present day write stories set in the past, but incorporate all they know of the intervening history between the two periods into the work. The early Assassin's Creed games, for all their many faults, really grabbed me the way they played with that idea, and it's about the only thing I still remember, or indeed like, about Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs. It's like a little in-joke between the writer and the audience that the characters aren't privy to, and it's done really well here. I really liked that aspect of the story. Another thing I loved was the story of how Much and Dandridge first came across the location of the gate, above which he eventually builds his house. It starts off as this very stereotypical, the land is so cursed not even the natives go there tale, and his native guide leaves him at the border, but then follows him the rest of the way anyway, because the ghost of the guide's grandfather calls him a coward for not accompanying Dandridge the whole way. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a lot of old pulp stories, but with a little more realism and a good amount of comedy, which is something that is sorely lacking in so much horror. I'm not talking about horror comedy, which is its own thing. I'm talking about works that are full-on horror, finding room to crack a joke without it clashing with the overall tone. And speaking back to the balance in horror I was talking about in the video's introduction, I think this story does a really good job of finding it. A lot of the horror is implied, like with the ghost of Meredith's mother, and whatever happened to her brother, but you're given just enough descriptive prose to let your imagination run wild on what the full picture might be, and it was really well done. On the other hand, this story is a prequel to a couple of others the author has written, and I've got to say, I felt pretty lost with everything that was going on. I got the sense reading the story that I was supposed to know at least a little context behind what was happening, and I just didn't have it. I read through it twice to see if I missed anything, and both times I felt like I was gripping onto the back of a train trying to keep my feet beneath me as it left the station. Another thing I think held the story back a bit was that it lacked a focused perspective. It kept jumping between Marchin and Meredith, which I wouldn't mind in a full-length novel, but in a 20-page short it just left things a little muddled. And for how great the story's connection to history is, it goes pretty much unexplained, and given how strong an aspect of the story it started out as, I would have liked to have had a bit more resolution to that side of the plot. The rest of the horror could stay vague, I don't mind that, but the history just kind of goes away, and I just don't really get it. Overall, this is a decent opening. I didn't click with it when I first read it, but the more I think about it, the more I like it. Enough so that I actually want to go and check out some of the author's other works. It's good. I'd still recommend it to Lovecraft fans. I just felt a little lost, which is why Andromeda Among the Stones is getting a B. Next we've got The Tugging by Ramsey Campbell, and I suspect this might get me some heat, but I didn't really get much out of it. It's a story about a reporter covering the discovery of a new planet, and the strange dreams that he suspects are connected. First off, I want to say I love the premise. There's something very existentially terrifying of looking up to discover there's something new in the sky that shouldn't be there. And I do enjoy the understated English stiff upper lip response everyone in the story has to it. It felt very believable, as did Ingalls the reporter as a character. But that doesn't mean I enjoyed reading from his perspective. He just didn't grab me as a protagonist. Another aspect of the story I was never going to like is the focus on dreams. Lovecraft's dream cycle never engaged me the way his waking mythos did, and that has apparently not changed when it's a different author writing about it. None of that is the story's fault, it's just my own preferences, and even then I still found stuff to enjoy, like its use of the hidden room in the old building trope, but overall I just didn't click with it. And worst of all, I didn't find it that scary. Aside from the premise, I don't think the horror elements really worked. I know Ramsey Campbell is very well regarded, and this is the only thing of his that I've ever read, so despite not really liking it all that much, it does make me want to go and search out his other works and give them a go, just to see if it's this specific story that I don't like, or if his whole body of work just isn't for me. If there are any Campbell fans watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts on why his writing works for you down in the comments, and what you think his best stories are. But as for The Tugging, I just thought it was mid, which is why it's going slap bang in the middle with a C. At number 3 we've got A Colder War by Charles Stross, and I just want to preface this review by saying I was pretty much guaranteed to love this one. Charles Stross is probably my favourite author writing right now. His stories play with ideas that I find really engaging, like the interactions between cultures with vastly different worldviews, people losing their humanity both figuratively and literally while trying to hold on to the people they used to be, and the socio-political fallout that comes with the destruction of a stereotypical masquerade. Plus, he's just really good at setting up an elaborate house of cards made of plot points and Chekhov's guns for the sole purpose of knocking them down in the third act in a whirlwind of chaos. So it should come as no surprise that A Colder War was exactly my kind of weird tale. It's a story about the Cold War if instead of nuclear weapons, both sides had access to the horrors from beyond space and time. I really loved the focus on global politics in this story, how the old horrors are no longer secrets and thus open to governmental exploitation, because you know if politicians actually had access to Shoggoths, they would absolutely use them regardless of the consequences. Another thing Stross is really good at as a writer is his ability to give scientific takes on weird magical tropes, and that is on full display in A Cold War as well. Humanity's fate on XK Masada was horrific but absolutely deserved. The line, quote, "there is a lot of history here, but no future," end quote, was haunting. And it doesn't shy away from the horrors of this kind of war without going too far and crossing into exploitation. I think it found the balance we've talked about before, where it gives you just enough to get your imagination going without taking away too much of the mystery. I do have some problems with it, like its use of tell don't show. This is a huge story constrained by a limited word count, and I wonder if it would have been better if it had been written as a full-length novel instead of a short. It's such a bleak story that it would be a really hard read if filled out across 300 odd pages, but I don't know. As it is, it feels a little held back, and that's reflected in the prose. Related to that is the protagonist, Roger Jurgensen, just isn't very compelling. Aside from the fact that he's just pretty milquetoast overall, he's so far away from most of the action that it kind of necessitates a lot of tell-don't-show storytelling. I'm not saying the kind of dry government agent character that he is can't work. Stross has proved that they can in the Laundry Files and the Merchant Prince's books. But when they're the only POV in such a crazy story, I just found him a little lacking. In a full-length book with other perspectives, I'm sure it wouldn't be a problem. And hey, maybe that kind of characterization was the point. And on that note, there was a lack of character overall in this one, which makes its apocalyptic final act less of a gut punch than it might have been with a fleshed out cast you actually care about. All of these cons are nitpicks though. I still really enjoyed A Colder War, and I would absolutely recommend it to any Lovecraft fans if you haven't given it a read already. It is a fantastic short, which is why it's getting an A. Next up is The Unthinkable by Bruce Sterling, and it really sucks that this story had to directly follow A Colder War, because it stood no chance of living up to that energy. It's a story about a friendly meeting between a pair of scientists, one from the United States, one from the Soviet Union, in an alternate Cold War where magic, rather than technology, is the norm. You see what I mean? The boy was done dirty by the table of contents. But even if the editor hadn't chosen to group these stories by subject as some of them are, I don't think this one would ever hold a candle to A Colder War in my mind. I'll start off by saying I really enjoyed the world building. The image of the Baba Yaga house crouched on the lawn is striking, and it immediately tells the reader this isn't the Earth as we know it. And I enjoyed the characters of Doughty and Saigonov. Even though they're fighting on opposite sides of the war, you can tell they respect each other professionally and think of themselves as friends, which is a nice change of pace after how bleak A Colder War got. Best of all, at least to my mind, the story doesn't outstay its welcome, which is a backhanded compliment, I know. But don't worry, I've got some open-handed insults as well. For one thing, the twist is just so obvious. It is in fact very thinkable, and it just doesn't go anywhere. Overall, the story just felt like the opening chapter to a book that was never written, and I really dislike that subgenre of short fiction, perhaps more than any other I've encountered, not just because they feel unfinished, but usually because the ideas to begin with aren't very interesting. And aside from the world building, that is definitely the case here. And probably worst of all, I just don't find it scary, which is odd because the horror at the heart of this story is something that can actually happen in real life, albeit in less fantastical circumstances, and is an absolute gut punch to those it happens to. I've never been through it myself, but I know people who have, and maybe that's why I find its use here so ineffective, because its inclusion is so momentary and surface level and obvious. Yeah, I really didn't get anything out of this story. I just thought it was very mid, and I'm pretty sure I would think that even if it hadn't directly followed A Colder War, which is why The Unthinkable is getting a very thinkable C. Boom. After that is Flash Frame by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and I have to say, this isn't just one of the best horror short stories I've ever read, this is one of the best short stories, period, that I've ever read. It tells the tale of a freelance yellow journalist who stumbles onto a story more jaundiced than the papers he writes for while cruising adult cinema El Taboo in 1980s Mexico City. There are a lot of things to love about this story, but the biggest for me has to be that it was actually scary. There's something very creepy about the idea of cursed films, that some message hidden in the celluloid might drive you mad or kill you. And there's a movie that came out a while ago, Antrim, that plays with that idea. It started off really well, framing itself as a documentary about the only public screening where the audience went mad, but then it shifts over to showing the cursed film in question, and it's just very dull. And after that point, the movie never really recovers. Flash Frame doesn't pretend to be a documentary, but it does do the cursed film aspect much better by only giving you glimpses of it throughout the story. And the fact that it's an obscure adult production, something that's already taboo, something that could really contain any and all sorts of nasty stuff, ratchets up the tension because it keeps you guessing. A little while ago I read The LA Quartet by James Ellroy, and those books were never shy about describing the horrible stuff that happens in the adult entertainment industry. So I had my hackles up waiting for the film in Flash Frame to suddenly go from a tame skin flick to something more horrific, and through that expectation managed to surprise me when it revealed the horror had been hiding in the movie all along. Plus, the sound is yellow. What a great opening line. Aside from Flash Frame's horror, I really loved the setting and the atmosphere because it screams so vividly off the page, and it's not something or somewhere that Lovecraft would have ever thought to write about in a million years. So it feels fresh in a way the previous 4 short stories really didn't. And I loved the twist ending. Like with the horror elements, I didn't see it coming at all. It was great. Sometimes when I review stories or novels that I really love, I find it hard to come up with criticisms because they're usually just nitpicks. So for Flash Frame, I'm not even going to bother. No notes. It's perfect. Flash Frame made me want to seek out the author's other works because it was just that compelling. It's genuinely one of the best short stories I've ever read, which is why it's getting an S. At number 6, there's Some Buried Memory by W.H. Pugmire, and I have to say I'm really torn on it. It's a tale about a ghoul raised as a human returning home at long last. This is another one I had to read multiple times because the first attempt I really didn't get anything out of it. The prose was great, it's wonderfully written, but the story really didn't do anything for me. As with a lot of these authors who I've never really encountered before, I looked Pugmire up after reading it for the first time, and reading more about the writer's body of work and personal life, I get it now. I get that it's very much a response to Lovecraft's The Outsider, but instead of a story of someone trapped in their own isolation, Some Buried Memory is more along the lines of embracing your own eccentricities and finding the right group of weirdos to be weird with, which is great. But even knowing that, understanding that, loving that in a way, there's just no meat to this story. It's barely a story at all. The idea of a ghoul being raised as a human is really interesting, but the story doesn't do anything with it. I didn't find Charlotte to be that compelling of a protagonist, and there was just nothing for me to grab onto. It doesn't even feel like a chapter from an unwritten book. It feels like a fragment of something even shorter. I was able to appreciate it a lot more on subsequent rereads. I get where it's coming from, but I don't think it's for me. That said, this is another case like the Tugging where I want to seek out other stuff Pugmire wrote to see if I vibe with that more. As for Some Buried Memory though, I really didn't enjoy it, which is why it's getting a C. Sorry. Then there's The Infernal History of the Ivybridge Twins by Molly Tanzer, and it was alright. It's a story about the titular twins as they grow from children to adulthood in their own weird way. It has a very whimsical, dark fairy tale vibe, which is something I'm just not a fan of in general. There are exceptions, like Alyssa, a game I covered on my other channel, but this story is not one of them. Instead, most of what I liked about it is much more technical in nature. For example, it tells a complete story, which is shockingly rare in a lot of shorts. There's no cliffhanger that leaves you wanting more, no aspect of it that feels undercooked or overindulged. It does everything it sets out to do within the limited scope of a short story, and it does it well. The characters were also very well written. All of them were well rounded, all of them had an arc, all of them had distinct personalities, which is hard enough in full-length novels, but even more difficult in something short like this. And while I'm not a fan of the tone, I am an absolute sucker for stories that take place over many years, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well. More damning than my own dislike of the story's tone is that I just didn't find it all that scary. There were disturbing elements, and if you've read the story you know exactly what I'm talking about, but none of it was all that frightening. There weren't really any big twists either. The narrative was pretty straightforward, and what revelations the story did have were pretty obvious to anyone familiar with the genre. I can always pretty accurately judge how engaged with something I was by how much of it I remember after the fact, and despite it not really being my sort of thing, I remember quite a lot of the Ivybridge twins, so I guess it did grab me to some extent, but it's not something I would call great. Take this comment however you want, but whenever I think of this story, I just get flashbacks of flipping through TV channels as a kid and settling on some random movie because it's there. Yeah, this is another one that really wasn't for me, but if you're a fan of dark fairy tales or whimsical horror, maybe give it a read. But for me, the infernal history of the Ivybridge twins is getting a B. Up next is Fat Face by Michael Shea, and this is another one I'm really torn on. It's a story about a working girl who returns to the beat after a stint in hospital who finds herself fascinated by the hydrotherapy clinic / pet groomer located across the road from the hotel where she plies her trade. I'm sure from that description alone, some of you are already going, oh dear, and in some ways you'd be right to, because this story has big man writing woman vibes. Aside from the fact all of the women are young and attractive and promiscuous and prostitutes and drug addicts who speak how middle-aged men think young ladies sound like, the lead just comes off as a caricature right from the opening lines. Quote, "When Patty came back to working the lobby of the Parnassus Hotel, it was clear she was liked from the way the other girls teased her and unobtrusively took it easy on her for the first few weeks while she got to feel steadier. She was deeply relieved to be back." End quote. But the moment the story lost me was this paragraph. Quote, "Patty was a lazy girl who lazily wanted things to be nice, but was very good at adjusting to things that were not nice at all if somebody strongly insisted on them. Part of it was that Patty was indecisive by nature. Left alone, she was made miserable by the lonely struggle of deciding what to do." End quote. Which is really frustrating because this story is actually genuinely horrifying. The setup of what's going on in the building across the road is really well done, and the reveal in the story's closing paragraphs is great. You just have to wade through so much other garbage to get to it. There are other things to like about the story. For example, I really like the West Coast setting. It feels so refreshing to be out of New England in a Lovecraftian horror story, and the tone is appropriately skeezy. It reminded me a lot of the subplot from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, where the player investigates some weird adult videotape circulating the Hollywood Hills. But there are other things to really not like about it as well, such as how the opening quote pretty much gives the game away regarding what's going on, and while it does leave Lovecraft's usual xenophobia behind, it does definitely stumble right into fatphobia instead. A lot of my criticisms probably stem from the fact Fat Face was written and originally published in 1987, when a lot of these things were seen, if not as less problematic, then with a lot more apathy by the publishing industry. But in 2023, there's really no getting past them. I want to like this story, but I just can't. There's good horror here if you can look past its shortcomings, but Fat Face just left a sour taste in my mouth. So I can't give it anything higher than a C. Sorry. At number 9 we've got Shoggoths in Bloom by Elizabeth Bear, and it was really good. It's a story about a black professor studying Shoggoths off the coast of Maine at the onset of World War II. This is exactly the kind of story I was hoping to see from the writers in this collection, because it engages with Lovecraft's mythos in ways the man himself never would have. Even something as small as having an African-American professor as the protagonist makes up for the New England setting. It helps that Harding is a really fun character. The guy's not afraid to crack jokes despite the cold shoulder he gets from everyone else in town, and the dilemma he's faced with at the end of the story is fantastic, as is the way he chooses to resolve it. He has great chemistry with Bert the Fisherman too, who comes off at first to both Harding and the reader as a bigot, but then they spend more time together and we learn there's more to his character than just his prejudices. He might definitely still be racist by today's standards, but for the late 1930s, early 1940s, he's a better egg than I expected. I also really just love the idea that Shoggoths simply exist in this setting, and people know about them, and you can charter a fishing boat to go and visit them if you want. Like with Flash Frame, I struggled to think of cons for this story, but it does have one major criticism that holds it back in my opinion, and that is it's not scary. Other than that though, I really enjoyed Shoggoths in Bloom. It engages with aspects of the Cthulhu mythos in a way that its own creator never could have conceived of, and presented an interesting perspective on one of its most famous monsters that are usually just used as something scary to menace the protagonists. I'd absolutely recommend it if you're a Lovecraft fan, but it's not quite perfect, which is why Shoggoths in Bloom is only getting an A. Bang. After that, there's Black Man with a Horn by T.E.D. Klein, and this is another one that is so close to perfect. It's a story about an author of Lovecraftian fiction who has a chance encounter mid-flight with a Christian missionary fleeing Malaysia under mysterious circumstances, and the rabbit hole of investigations it sends him down. My biggest takeaway from this story is just how believable a protagonist it has. The narrator feels like a real person. He's a man on the wrong side of middle age in the 1980s, and as a result is still casually racist toward the people of colour he encounters. He's an extremely bitter writer who hates that he's only remembered as Lovecraft's disciple rather than for his own work. He's just a very toxic person, and yet he draws you along in his research into the Cho, because for all his faults, he's very charismatic, and the mystery he uncovers is very intriguing. The story makes great use of less is more, tell don't show horror as well. So much of the tale's most frightening moments are done through truncated second-hand accounts or by implication. It gives you just enough to conjure up some horrible image in your own mind without ruining it by throwing any sort of concrete description into the prose. That said, it does feel a little lacking. Maybe it leaves a little too much to the imagination. Maybe it doesn't resolve as much as it could, because it sets up this fantastic mystery and then doesn't really do anything with it by the final paragraph. I suppose whether or not these are good or bad things will depend on your own tastes as a reader, but for me, I was super invested, super engaged, and then it was over and I thought, that's it? On the other hand, I don't really know how much further it could have gone, other than the slightly ridiculous territory of the protagonist narrating his own death as the monster climbs in through a window to kill him, which is always silly when it comes up in video games, and would have ruined the tone of this story too. A less subjective criticism I can point to is how the story undeniably and unironically indulges in a lot of stereotypes of savage natives wielding ungodly power. Sure, the Cho are speculated in universe to maybe being descended from French colonists, and they're regarded as weird and creepy even by other Malaysian peoples that the missionary encounters, sort of like how the bad guys in Bone Tomahawk are seen by other Native Americans in that story. But it's so vague on so many things that it still comes off as a little bit gronky. Like Fatface, Black Man with a Horn was written in the 1980s, so it's probably fair for its day, but to engage with these sorts of tropes at face value would not fly in 2023 at all. It's still a great read, I still really love it. I definitely recommend it, especially if you're a fan of works like David Fincher's Zodiac, where it's the investigation rather than the answers that are the point of the story, but boy is it hard to overlook the racism, which is why Black Man with a Horn can only really rise as high as an A. Boom. At number 11, we've got Than Curse the Darkness by David Drake, and I hated this story so much. I hated it so much I almost gave Black Man with a Horn an S out of spite, because for all its problems, at least it isn't this. It's a tale about the Congo Free State and the atrocities committed within it, driving the Congolese to a new god in order to escape their suffering. There's so much to say about this story, I barely even know where to begin. I will say that it does come up with some interesting ideas and sometimes engages with them in interesting ways. The idea that you can cause so much misery to a group of people that they'll turn to a Lovecraftian god to destroy the world in order to be free of their suffering is fascinating, and actually goes a long way in explaining why these stereotypical cultists of colour that Lovecraft is so known for would turn to these sorts of activities. And I love the description of Lovecraftian gods as being like like cancers, that you can't defeat them, only hold them back. Plus, it doesn't shy away from the atrocities committed in the Congo Free State, nor how vile the people who committed them were. But that's about the only good I can say about Than Curse the Darkness, because the rest of it is absolute garbage. For one thing, this story is framed from the perspective of the European colonizers, which is accurate to Lovecraft, but it leaves a really sour aftertaste because so many of them are such awful people. If this had been written in the period in which it is set, there would be a lot of white man's burden imperialist rhetoric insulating the characters morally from the terrible things they do. But Than Curse the Darkness doesn't pretend that these are good people. They present the atrocities they commit as atrocities, and with a disturbing amount of historical accuracy, without actually saying anything about them. It's just so callous. There are ways to tell stories where horrible people end up doing good things, or even find redemption, but that requires nuance and depth, and a good execution, which Than Curse the Darkness just does not have. All of the characters are flat as cardboard, and their one shared personality trait is evil colonizer. But monotone, you might ask. What about the Congolese? Well, they're barely in the story at all. They're never given a point of view or any kind of voice. They're not treated with depth or nuance. They're just faceless villains. There's only one sympathetic point of view character, and he's not even from Africa at all. He's Portuguese, and his wife, while African, is not Congolese. I can't remember exactly where in Africa she's from, and I don't want to read the story again to find out. Sorry. The whole time I was reading this story, I kept thinking back to the Book of Nightwomen by Marlon James, which is about a slave revolt on an island off the coast of Jamaica from the perspective of the slaves, and it actually engages with its premise in an interesting and insightful way. There are a lot of awful people in that story, but they are people. They have depth. They have motivations that don't always align, even when they're on the same side of the conflict. It's another story that doesn't shy away from the horrors of slavery and European imperialism, but it does it so much better than Curse the Darkness, because it actually gives both sides a voice, and doesn't just callously present the atrocities committed in the name of imperialism. It's ugly and it's raw, and it doesn't end with the European colonizers going, well, we won, so we're the good guys. I understand the intent behind Than Curse the Darkness. There probably is an interesting story to be written by engaging with the thought experiment of what could cause these people to seek out a god in order to destroy the world, but this is not it. Than Curse the Darkness is awful. Do not read it. Get in the bin. F. Moving on from that, there's Jeroboam Henley's Debt by Charles R. Saunders, and it was pretty good. We should bring back the Boam names. Jeroboam, Rehoboam, they're just fun to say. It's a story about a man coming to the aid of an old friend in the dead of night regarding an old wrong committed by the titular Jeroboam Henley. This story is such a stark contrast to Than Curse the Darkness, it's almost like getting slapped in the face. Jeroboam Henley's Debt is written by an African-American author, and it delves deep into the African-American experience over the past 200-odd years of the United States' existence. It does not shy away from the horrors of slavery, or the horrors people trapped in such a system can commit against each other, and it does so with the nuance required to avoid coming off as callous or exploitative. The two leads are really well written too. Their friendship comes off as very believable, and I love how they're so out of their element in this situation, despite the story focusing on things stereotypically associated with African Americans like voodoo. And the twist was genuinely shocking. I didn't see it coming, and it is absolutely tragic. This is another perfect read. It's exactly the kind of story I was hoping to find in this collection, and I really can't think of anything I didn't like, so I'm not even going to bother trying to nitpick it. It's short, it's sweet, it's devastating. Jeroboam Henley's Debt is absolutely worth reading if you're looking for an African-American perspective on Lovecraft's mythos, and that's why it's getting an S. Continuing the rollercoaster of quality, there's Nethescurial by Thomas Ligotti, and what even is there to say? Before I try to review this story, I just want to preface it by saying I don't like Thomas Ligotti's writing. I tried to read the omnibus collection of his short stories a few years back, and I genuinely couldn't finish it. I cannot stand the way he writes. I really don't engage with with the sort of ideas he tends to focus on, he's really just not for me. So needless to say, Nethescurial was a story I was never going to like. I'm not even sure what it was about. I think it's the story of someone reading a letter from an adventurer searching for a fragment of an idol depicting some Lovecraftian god named Nethescurial, the fragments of which can be found on mysterious islands of the same name located all over the world, but I genuinely can't tell. I always try to find some positive aspects of every piece of media I come across. That was the whole point of the channel's original formula of 3 pros and 3 cons, and I don't go into things wanting to hate them, but I cannot find anything to like about this, I'm sorry. I've tried to read it 3 or 4 times at this point, and it does nothing for me. It's well structured, faint praise as that is. There are ideas inherent to cosmic horror that I usually really like, such as mysterious islands, but I don't think they're used in this story very well. I praised Black Man with a Horn for not ending with, "Even as I write this, the monster is climbing through the window to kill me," and that's pretty much how Nethescurial ends. There's very little character, there's very little plot. As with every Ligotti story I've ever read, it just feels like it takes forever to go nowhere. I know he's really well regarded, the same as Ramsey Campbell, so if you're a fan of his writing, please let me know why. What is it about his stories that you enjoy? Because personally, I just find him really pretentious. To each their own, but personally I wouldn't recommend it, and Nethescurial's getting an F. Sorry. Then there's Calamari Curls by Cage Baker, and it was certainly more straightforward, but it's definitely still got some problems. It's a story about a disgruntled shop owner in a sleepy seaside town who finds his customers slowly stolen away by a newly opened club, the titular Calamari Curls, and sets out to do something about it. The first thing that sticks out in my mind about this story is how gaudy and awful the Calamari Curls is with its bright, clashing colours and its trend-chasing attractions. It feels like the exact kind of awful place that would only open up in a quiet town, and that authenticity makes it very easy to root for Mr. Bright, the protagonist, despite him being such an awful person. Because deep down, every one of us knows about a place like this, and we all want them to die. On that note, the protagonist might be a piece of garbage, but he's well written, and I like how for all his bigotry, he's not above teaming up with a trans woman to see the Calamari Curls burn. I really want to like Elizabeth Marks as well, but her inclusion just reeks of tokenism. She describes herself as a performance artist, interpretive dancer, and transgender shaman, which is very on brand for trans people, but the prose never genders her correctly, and she never actually says a word. All her communication is done through dance and gestures, and I don't know, it just strikes me as though the author went, well, we can't do the magical African trope anymore, so we'll have a magical trans person instead. And that idea is interesting, and there's probably a way to do it well, but this is not it. Aside from that, I don't really have any major criticisms. It tells a complete story, it's got some fun moments, especially at the end when things go crazy, and there's a great undercurrent of the whole town going, not this again, like this kind of Lovecraftian chaos is a recurring problem in their lives. If you've ever seen a small town invaded by some big expensive business ventures, then this story definitely provides a sense of catharsis. But its innocent transphobia does bring it down a notch in my opinion, which is why Calamari Curls is getting a B. Boom. At number 15, there's Jihad over Innsmouth by Edward Morris, and from that title alone, you know you're in for something bonkers, and it does not disappoint. It's the story of a Sufi Muslim assassin who finds himself forced into action when the Deep Ones hijack a commercial airliner in revenge for the US government's treatment of Innsmouth. This is a story that would not be written at any other point in history than Bush's America in the wake of 9/11, and that weird reactionary quality makes it so incredibly dated by today's standards. All of the other stories in this collection have felt out of time in a way, regardless of when they're set or when they were actually written, but Jihad over Innsmouth is so aggressively early 2000s, which is so weird. It's not something that's a positive or a negative, but it is impossible to ignore while reading it. Anyway, I've kind of got to give praise for such a wild premise. I didn't think you could do Lovecraftian horror at 30,000 feet, but somehow the story makes it work. I also really really enjoyed how unfazed the protagonist is about everything that's happening. He's already on the plane to take out a publicly prominent Deep One in disguise, and all the hijacking does is make his job harder. You can feel his annoyance at the situation when everything goes crazy. That said, while the protagonist might be a Sufi Muslim in the context of the story, the representation is only surface level. He just comes off as any other cool hitman otherwise, which I guess is fine because it could have been a lot worse. A more significant criticism is that it isn't really scary. It's much more of an action thriller than it is a horror story, which I don't think fits well into the Cthulhu mythos. Not to say that the action is bad, it's fine, but the vibe is just wrong. The pacing feels pretty rushed as well. It starts off alright with the hero describing his job and his past, but as soon as the Deep Ones hijack the plane, it shoots off at breakneck speed to reach the end as quickly as it can. An issue of the short story as a medium, I suppose. For how insane the title is, and for how crazy the premise turned out to be, I've got to say Jihad over Innsmouth left me kind of wanting. It's still a lot of fun, I'd definitely give it a read for the premise alone, but it's certainly not the best use of the Cthulhu mythos, which is why it's getting a B. Next up, there's Bad Sushi by Cherie Priest, and it was interesting. It's a story about an elderly Japanese chef who notices some strange changes to the quality of the seafood in the restaurant at which he works. Aside from Charles Stross and Thomas Ligotti, Cherie Priest is the only author with work in this collection who I've read before, and I remember really enjoying the stuff of hers that I did read, so I'm sorry to say Bad Sushi left me a little disappointed. Not because it was bad, it just wasn't as good as what I was expecting. I do really like the main protagonist. It's rare that I've come across elderly heroes, so Baku was a nice change of pace, and also very different from the lead in Black Man with a Horn. Baku might be just as dedicated to his work, but he's nowhere near as bitter about his situation. He's content in his job and his reputation and his lot in life. I also liked how he's a former soldier who fought for Japan during World War II, but has completely left that part of his life behind. The only reason it comes up in the story at all is because of his previous encounter with a Lovecraftian horror during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. But what I thought the story did best regarding Baku's character is how it portrays the social invisibility elderly people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Baku notices Sanada's patrons changing as a result of the bad sushi, but they don't really notice him noticing, and by the time they do realise he's onto them, it's too late. He's already made up his mind about stopping them. But aside from a great lead character, I thought Bad Sushi was mostly pretty generic. The old soldier picking up his sword for one last battle is a fun trope, but it is still a trope, and this story doesn't really put any new spin on it. It has some good build-up, but the climax of the story just devolves into a crazy action set piece. There's some good paranoid horror to be found, but I wouldn't call it scary, and aside from Baku, there aren't really any lead characters to speak of, which on the one hand works really well to establish his isolation from the people around him, even his own co-workers, but also means that when these people do start to go through some Lovecraftian changes, we as the reader feel nothing because we just don't know them. There is a good story here. I guess it comes down to whether or not you think it's executed well, and in my opinion, it could have been done better. I want to like it more than I do, but I'd still recommend it, and that's why Bad Sushi is getting a B. Following that, there's The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife by John Horner Jacobs, and I get it, that doesn't make it good. It's a story about a woman in a sleepy seaside town out courting a young tourist after her husband mysteriously leaves the picture. I've already mentioned how much I dislike short stories in general, but the shortest stories have to be the ones I like the least, and this is a perfect example of that, because they always have an interesting idea that is never given enough time to be properly fleshed out. It's hard to avoid spoilers in this story because it is so short, but I will say that the twist is interesting. The character at the heart of the conflict has a lot of potential to be an amazing tragic villain, but the whole thing goes by so quickly that the opportunity to create something truly special is just wasted. The situation at the center of this story is horrifying and tragic, and it deserves more than this short story. I completely understand why a tale with this idea belongs in a collection of the best Lovecraftian fiction, but this is not the way to do it justice. Aside from my thoughts on the story's length, it's also extremely horny, more so even than Flash Frame or Fat Face, which were both about adult entertainment industries. And that isn't a bad thing. Sex definitely has its place in horror if done right, but in such a short story, its inclusion just feels rushed. This is another one that I want to like more than I do. It's such an interesting idea that again, I think it deserves more than a short story. I want to recommend it, but I just can't, which is why The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife is getting a D for disappointing. Thankfully, The Doom That Came to Innsmouth by Brian McNaughton did a better job of realising its own potential. It's a story about a descendant of Innsmouth's diaspora who returns to his ancestral home as part of a government compensation program set up to help the men and women displaced by the town's destruction in the original short story. But not everything is as it seems. Right off the bat, I really like how the story engages with the fallout of Innsmouth's destruction by the United States military in the original story, how the townspeople were displaced all across the country and forced to live away from the sea. I also really enjoyed how the story plays with the ways medical science would explain the famous Innsmouth look, and how those with it might hide their ancestry with wigs and other stuff like that. It's a story that knows how to pull off a good bait and switch, too. Going into it, I expected it to be an inversion of the original Innsmouth story. We know going in the narrator is a dormant deep one, and instead of dodging his hostile distant kin, he would be dodging the United States government, trying to keep a lid on his existence, and eventually he would lead his brethren in taking vengeance for what was done to them. And in some ways, The Doom That Came to Innsmouth is that, but not at all in the way I was expecting. It does a great job of putting all the pieces right in front of your face, but only revealing to the reader how they fit together in the last act of the story. It might not be scary, but it was genuinely chilling to suddenly learn the truth about what was really going on. That said, it's not all sunshine and roses. The story doesn't shy away from depictions of sexual assault, although it's thankfully not that gratuitous. This is no Neonomicon. Less icky is the fact that the Government Institute at Innsmouth is such a stereotypical madhouse that it almost comes off as caricature. It's the kind of thing Lovecraft might barely have got away with in the 1920s, but playing the trope straight even in 1999 comes off as pretty silly. The story is otherwise pretty grounded, in as much as a cosmic horror story can be, but that aspect of it took me right out of the narrative. If you can get past the sexual assault, I think this is an interesting sequel to The Shadow over Innsmouth that plays with the consequences of the original story really well. It's just a shame about the haunted house insane asylum that takes up so much of the middle act, which is why I can't give it anything higher than a B. At number 19 there's Lost Stars by Anne K. Schwader, and it was another great story. It's the tale of a woman who finds herself drawn into her friend's self-help group, whose mysterious new leader promises her followers whatever they desire. If I can put on my history nerd hat for a moment, I've never been a huge ancient Egypt buff. I've always found the states of Mesopotamia to be way more interesting, but I cannot deny there is something fascinating about them both, and this story engages with that fascination really well. It's always fun when cosmic horror blends its own monsters with the weirdness of real-world ancient mythologies, and it was just interesting to have one of these stories incorporate so much history and archaeology from a real place into its plot, given the focus is usually on something already established from the mythos or a new creation of the authors. Another thing I really liked about this story is how it's very much a woman's experience of cosmic horror, rather than what a man might think a woman's experience of cosmic horror could be. It dives deep into friendships between women without resorting to the all women hate each other trope. It dives deep into New Age mysticism and self-help groups without being overly critical or cruel, and it plays with how both of these things might be exploited through some really good horror. The only story from this collection so far far to get the same sort of visceral reaction out of me with any of its horror elements has been Fatface, and if you've read Lost Stars yourself, you know exactly the scene I'm talking about. That was great. Aside from the moments of body horror, the story's villain is really good too. It is really hard to get across how impossibly ancient and inhuman some of the monsters in the Cthulhu mythos are, due to how difficult that is to comprehend from the perspective of a mere mortal. Which is in some ways the point, right? But Lost Stars actually succeeds in doing that. The only other story I can think of that pulled it off this well was It by Stephen King, and that took over 1,000 pages. Lost Stars does it in like 20. I really wish I could say I don't have any problems with it, but there are some things about the story that brought it down a little. This is another story that devolves into an out-of-place action climax that feels really weird in a cosmic horror story, although the last lines do bring it back a bit. It makes liberal use of the old mentor with critical information dies moments before they can deliver it trope too, which is a bit boring. I think it would have been more fun for Diane to dig up the information herself, but it's a short story, so what can you do? Nitpicks aside, I really enjoyed Lost Stars. It's so close to an S that I almost want to nudge it over the line anyway, but I can't, so it's getting an A. After that, there's the Oram County Whosit by Steve Duffy, and of all the stories collected in this book, this one feels the closest to something Lovecraft might have written, only updated to a more modern sense of writing. It's the story of a journalist sent to investigate a mysterious Whosit dug up by the coal miners of Oram, West Virginia, as told many years after the fact by the photographer sent to accompany him. One thing about this story that I really liked is the two lead characters. They reminded me a lot of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, one of them being this famous investigator of the strange, and the other being his offsider who narrates the thing. They've got great chemistry, and they come off as believable people. The journalist might be a bit of a prat, but he's a decent guy who looks out for the photographer, who might be a bit rough around the edges, but you can't accuse him of being a coward. The town and its people might be less prominent overall, but they still have character. The mayor's a money-grubbing scumbag, the miners are tight-knit and loyal to one another, and their internal conflicts come across clearly to the pair of outsiders sent to cover the story. It has some great build-up too, such as the scene where the journalist and the photographer get to see the huge block of coal that contained the titular Whosit. The thing might be long gone, but its shape pressed into rock is way creepier than its physical appearance later on in the plot. That doesn't mean the action climax isn't exciting, and it certainly doesn't skimp on the gore. Plus, it's just nice to get a proper description of a monster for a change. That said, it did come off as a little repetitive for a short story. What with the journalist's story of his first encounter with a Whosit while working as a miner in Alaska years earlier, and then more or less the same sequence of events in the present day with the monster dug up in Oram. It's not like there's a twist to it or anything, it's the same sort of monster twice in a row in the space of 30 odd pages. But aside from that, I can't think of anything I disliked about it. It was a very classic sort of cosmic horror story, and while I don't think it holds a candle to Lovecraft at his best, it's certainly nice to return to that style every now and then. I'd recommend it if you've ever wished Lovecraft was a bit more descriptive, or a bit better at characters and dialogue, because it does tell a decent story, but I just can't get over how repetitive it is, which is why the Oram County Whosit is getting a B. At number 21, there's The Crawling Sky by Joe R. Lansdale, and it was great. It tells the story of a wandering priest who comes across a town where a recent mysterious killing has taken place, and his quest to bring the murderer to justice with hot lead and the grace of God. The thing I love most about this story is that it captures the feel of a really well-played one-shot campaign of Call of Cthulhu. I've taken part in games that had this kind of tone and followed the same sort of structure. The players arrive in town, do a little investigating with the locals, and then discover the home of the monster at the heart of the story and attempt to kill it. I'm not sure if it actually was a game of Call of Cthulhu prior to it being written out as this short story, but even if it wasn't, it captures the vibe so well that you could easily translate it into a TTRPG module if you wanted. I also really really liked how believable the town felt. It's the kind of place that the rest of the world has already forgotten about, even centuries ago at the time I'm pretty sure this story is set. The locals are all wretched and insular, the buildings are all ancient and rotting, the only way to improve one's life is to get out, and that sense of place came across really strong in the prose and characterization. Speaking of which, this short had a very strong, if minimal, cast. The priest is kind of like the audience surrogate given he's come to town in search of a monster to kill, but he still has his own character, and you get the sense he has a lot of history. The sheriff is just a slimeball, but there is a weird kind of vile charisma in the way he carries himself and conducts his business, and Norval just feels like a guy trying to make a better life for himself, unwittingly caught up in some Lovecraftian horror. They and the town of Woodtick ground the story really well in the opening act, so that when the horror elements start creeping into prominence later on, they come off as genuinely alien. The kind of monster encountered in this story is nothing you probably haven't seen before, but is presented and described in such an interesting way that it comes off as quite refreshing, and for once the invincible evil having a weak point is actually explained in the story in a way that makes sense. It doesn't feel like a cop-out. The crawling sky still resorts to a big fight in its closing moments, but the setup of the house it haunts, and its history from years before Norval came to own it, do go a long way in building up enough dread to make it feel earned. One real criticism is that the inciting incident is a woman getting stuffed in the fridge, which is just a tired trope at this point, but ultimately, that's just a nitpick. Overall, this was a really good story. I'd recommend it anyway, but especially if you're looking for one-shot ideas in Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green, which is why The Crawling Sky is getting an A. Then there's The Fairground Horror by Brian Lumley, and it was okay. It's the story of two brothers who operate a carnival freak show, and the strange artifacts they start to incorporate into their act. One thing I really enjoyed about this story is how one man's greed almost caused more damage through his attempts to exploit the horrors from beyond space and time, without understanding what he's dealing with, than the cultists who actually worship the things and want to keep everything secret. I think it's a really cool spin on so many ideas from the Cthulhu mythos, that you're diving deeper into the secrets mankind was never meant to know, not because you want to uncover the truth or stop some otherworldly horror from gaining a foothold in reality, but because there's got to be some way to make money out of it. I like the idea of a travelling carnival as a secret base of the Cthulhu cult. Given they're always on the move, it would be hard to pin them down if any of their crimes were ever uncovered. There wasn't that much character, but there was a strong contrast between Anderson and Hamilton Tharp, one of them being an explorer devout to the cult of Cthulhu, and the other being a greedy freak show operator. They're both awful men in their own ways, and I like how the story was able to make one of them more sympathetic to begin with, before revealing, oh, he's actually much worse. There's some good body horror in the story as well, although having any sort of Lovecraftian god speak in plain English to a human being does diminish their mystique and scare factor a little bit. A bigger problem with the story in my mind is that it feels so dragged out. It's over 30 pages long, but I don't think it needed to be more than 20. By the time I reached the ending, I was more than ready for it to be over. That said, the ending was good. It wasn't exactly a twist, but it made sense, and it was satisfying. Overall, this was a decent story. I didn't hate it, I didn't love it, it was just good, which is why I'd only recommend it to die-hard fans of cosmic horror, and also why it's getting a B. Next up, there's Cinderlands by Tim Pratt, and the author really had no idea how to end this story, huh? It's the tale of a man fixing up an old house on the outskirts of town, and the strange noises he hears at night whenever he tries to sleep. This story is very much a modern retelling of Lovecraft's The Rats in the Walls. Instead of an ancestral English manor house, there's a dingy fixer-upper. Instead of a black cat with a racial slur for a name, there's a black cat called Ninja Man. Stuff like that. that. I've always found the rats in the walls to be a little overrated, and to be perfectly honest, I think Cinderlands does a better job with its setup than the original story did. The way it opens with the protagonist waking up confused about where he's living is really good, as are all the odd little things about the property that on their own wouldn't raise any questions, but together come off as really creepy. Stuff like all the rusty metal hidden in the soil, or the sounds inside the walls at night, and the protagonist really has no one to turn to. Not friends or family because he doesn't really have any, not his neighbours because the outskirts are almost entirely derelict, and not even the city because he's despised by emergency services due to events that took place prior to the story's beginning. His isolated struggle with the weirdness around him comes off really strong. The problem is, the story just doesn't know where it's going. There's a big crazy nightmare of a climax, and it does engage with an idea that is quite frightening. What could possibly cause an unknowable horror to flee in terror? But before you even have time to process the idea, it just ends, and in a really silly way too. I didn't like the appearance of the creepy old neighbour who vanishes halfway through his conversation with the protagonist either, because it's such a stereotype by now. There's some good horror here. The story brings up some great ideas, and beats Lovecraft at his own game in one or two moments, but too much is left unexplained, and it just had no idea how to conclude. A lot of the stories in this collection have left me haunted by the final word. Cinderlands just left me confused. I might prefer it overall to The Rats in the Walls, but Lovecraft's original story definitely had a better ending. I'd still recommend Cinderlands, especially if you're a fan of Rats in the Walls, but overall it just left me wanting, which is why it's getting a C. Continuing the trend of stories I really didn't get, there's Lord of the Land by Gene Wolfe, and I am so confused. It's a story about, I think, a folklorist known almost exclusively as the Nebraskan listening to the tale of an elderly farmer about a strange encounter he had as a young man while shooting crows. Things I definitely know about the story is that it's well written. I'm personally not a fan of using phonetic accents in written dialogue, but Old Man Thacker's speech wasn't too bad in that regard. It helps that the story he tells is pretty creepy on its own. Setting up a bait to lure crows over just to gun them down all afternoon is not a recreational pursuit I think many people would go for anymore. It feels out of another time, even before the cosmic horror enters the picture. I also really liked the monster that inevitably shows up, how the Nebraskan is able to connect its behaviour to creatures from ancient mythology in a way that suggests how those myths might have once come about in a believable way. It's another monster like the villain of Lost Stars that feels believably ancient and otherworldly, and its speculated history is really cool. I really enjoyed that. But aside from those parts of the story, I really didn't get anything out of it. I didn't really like the characters, I didn't really like either of the twists, and overall it just felt like several different unrelated ideas for a short story smashed together really awkwardly. As with so many of these shorts, it sets up this really creepy atmosphere and really unsettling creature, and then just ends with a big fight that throws the mood right out the window. I've never read anything else of Gene Wolfe's, although I know he's well regarded, so despite my disappointment with Lord of the Land, it does make me want to seek out some other things he's written to see if this one's just a dud, or if he's not really for me overall like Thomas Ligotti. It's frustrating because there are things in this story I really like, and I want to recommend it for those elements, but everything else was just so confused that I don't think I can. It was fine, but it really wasn't for me, which is why Lord of the Land is getting a C. Sorry. Thankfully, To Live and Die in Arkham by Joseph S. Pulver Sr. is way more straightforward, but is it good? It's the story of a petty criminal hired by an academic to steal a Lovecraftian artifact from the home of a rival, but not everything is as it seems. Right off the bat, this is barely a horror story. It's much closer to crime, and more than anything, it reminded me of the works of James Ellroy with its focus on the seedy underbelly of organised crime and sharp staccato prose. It's only because the artifact the academic wants stolen is Lovecraftian in nature that the story veers into cosmic horror in the final act, but otherwise it's a very straightforward crime short, and you know what? It was actually pretty refreshing. It's also very amusing to me that the crime story is one of the few in a collection of horror tales not to end in some grand action set-piece climax. It's a very very short story, even by the standards of this collection, but its 3 lead characters are really well realised. Daniel Washington is not a nice guy. He swears like a sailor and is generally pretty unpleasant to be around, but he's not inhuman. He's capable of empathy, and despite being a criminal, he conducts himself like a businessman. The academic comes off as your stereotypical fastidious professor, but is capable of some awful things when he thinks no one is watching. And the rival academic in possession of the artifact, while the weakest of the 3, is compelling in his own way. The author could have very easily stretched this story out into a doorstopper epic with a cast of thousands in the vein of Elroy, but instead the plot is stripped down to its most basic, most essential elements that does in around 10 pages what some writers can't do in 700. That streamlined pacing is something I really like about the story, but it also means some of the darker tropes of crime fiction come flying at you out of nowhere. The story deals with sexual assault and suicide, but always from a distance, and it's jarring when they show up only for the story to end a few pages later. In a longer novel, these elements could have been given more nuance, but in a short story they're just sort of there, and then they go away. At least the ending is quite satisfying. The story might not be the most conventional weird tale inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, but I've never seen cosmic horror done this way, and I can't deny how much of a breath of fresh air it was. I'd recommend it, just don't go in expecting anything particularly scary, and To Live and Die in Arkham is getting a B. After that, there's The Shallows by John Langan, and it was unlike any cosmic horror I've ever read. I don't know if I liked it or if I didn't, but I can't deny how unique it is. It's the story of a man tending to his garden in the wake of some kind of world-changing Lovecraftian singularity. I've always wondered what people might do after the stars go wrong and the horrors return. Most cosmic horror stories that deal with this sort of plot point go right up to the event horizon of the singularity, but never cross the threshold, and I can't really blame them, since how do you depict what life is like on the other side? The Shallows actually offers an answer that some people would just keep on keeping on as they had before the world ended, and given the state of things right now, that feels depressingly on point. The narrator and his crab friend encounter some strange things growing in the garden, but they treat it as just a matter of course. Whatever shock they might have presented originally has long worn off, up to and including the fact the narrator has a crab friend. But the weirdness is still contrasted really well by the stories the narrator tells of his life before the singularity, which make up the bulk of the word count, and it helps that the stories he tells are really interesting, even if the stakes are low, no different from the narrator's wander through his garden. Aside from the narrator, the story has a couple of strong leading characters in his wife and son. You get a real sense of the kind of people they were, despite only hearing about them through the narrator's perspective. It leaves a lot up to the reader, mainly the events during and immediately after the disaster that ended the world, and it did get a little frustrating with how vague it was with concrete details, but given the themes of the story, I don't really mind. I think it worked. If I have any criticisms, it's that it's not really all that scary. There's an undercurrent of unease with how mundane the new world has become for the narrator, but there are no big frightening moments. All the horror is in the subtext, which as we all know, is for cowards. Overall, I don't really know what to think about this story. It did a lot of things and engaged with a lot of ideas that I've always wanted a cosmic horror tale to tackle, and it did them well. But despite that, it didn't grab me the way some other works collected in this book have. It's definitely an interesting take on the idea, so I would absolutely recommend it for that. But I don't know. It just didn't hook me, which is why The Shallows is getting a B. Last but certainly not least is The Men From Porlock by Laird Barron, and it was great. It tells the tale of a hunting party of loggers sent off into the unknown woods of the Pacific Northwest to bag some bucks for the upcoming dinner of a visiting bigwig who unwittingly stumble onto something ancient and unknowable. First off, I loved the atmosphere of this story. It's so grimy and grungy and sweaty and humid. It conveys the awful working conditions of the 1920s logging industry really well, and the closed-off toughness of the men who work it too. The physical descriptions and antiquated dialogue make the characters scream off the page, and there's a surprising number of them for a short story too. In a genre so obsessed with the untamed exotic jungles of South America, Africa, Asia, and even Australia to some extent, it was great to have that obsession turned inward on America itself for a change, in an area of the United States Lovecraft rarely wrote about. It does such a good job of setting a mood, both in the logging camp and then with the hunting party alone in the woods, which is already quite bleak and desperate, that when the characters inevitably stumble onto some strangeness, it's like a gut punch. You know there's no hope of them getting a happy ending. I really don't want to spoil things for this story because the surprise of what they find is great. It's totally unexpected and I loved it. I didn't even mind when the story suddenly broke out into a big bloody action scene halfway through because it felt appropriately desperate from both sides, and it wasn't between the plucky human protagonists and some eldritch nightmare god. Unfortunately, after the fight I felt the story kind of went a bit loose at the seams. There are still good moments, some fun cosmic horror that's a little more conventional, but the atmosphere definitely settles down. Plus, it has a trope that I really don't like, where a character randomly shows up at the end to explain things. I liked the character and his presentation, but his use at the end of the story was kind of bland. I really want to give this one an S, because the first two acts are perfect, but I just cannot overlook the stumble toward the end. That said, I'd still absolutely recommend it because it doesn't just feel like a regurgitation of Lovecraft's own stories with some extra gore and profanity, especially if you're a fan of folk horror like The Witch or Midsummer or even The Ritual. I can't think of a better story to end the collection on, but unfortunately, the best I can give the Men From Porlock is an A. It was very close to an S though. So that was the Book of Cthulhu. Overall, I think its quality was more consistent than the Lovecraft collection I reviewed in 2022, but the highs and lows were nowhere near as extreme. Some of the stories still definitely engaged in some garbage like xenophobia, fatphobia, transphobia, innocent or otherwise, but I think those problems were overall outshined by the myriad voices the collection included. If there were any consistent problems the stories had, it's that so few of them knew how to end in a satisfying way. That said, I went in wanting to read cosmic horror from new perspectives. Women, people of colour, queer people, and all combinations thereof. And that's pretty much what I got. If any of them took your fancy, absolutely seek them out. Even if I said they were crap. Just because I didn't like them doesn't mean you won't. It's a good collection, which is why the Book of Cthulhu is getting an A. But now that we're here at the end of everything, it just doesn't feel like Halloween without a story from Lovecraft himself. So since I'm here, I also read his best, worst, and only comedy short, Sweet Ermengarde. It tells the tale of Ethel Ermengarde Stubbs, a bachelorette looking for love and wealth in an uncaring world. Now, I'm really not a fan of 19th and early 20th century literature. So much of it is twee crap, so to see the style eviscerated in such a biting parody was actually quite cathartic. There is nothing affectionate about the way Sweet Ermengarde parodies its subject. You can tell Lovecraft hates this sort of fiction and is taking great joy in ripping it apart. It hits all the right notes in all the right order. A greedy villain wanting to foreclose on the Stubbs' farm, a childhood friend who goes off to make a fortune in the big city but never returns, a rich widow who takes in Ermengarde when she gets lost. It's great. Sweet Ermengarde might have the best characters Lovecraft's ever written too, because the weird inhuman way he writes people fits really well into comedy. Ermengarde herself is such an awful person. She's a selfish fool who does some crazy things, like pushing someone out of a moving train. Squire Hardman, the villain, feels like a prototypical Snidely Whiplash. He's so much fun, and his comeuppance caught me completely off guard. Mrs. Van Itty has such a bad pun of a name she almost made me cringe out of existence, but it's it's not even only the characters that come off as more human than usual. Lovecraft's prose feels more informal than it is in any of his horror tales. The guy knows how to crack a joke, and he does it well. The story got a couple of laughs out of me, which I was not expecting at all. Better yet, there's none of his usual xenophobia. It's just a fun little story. Its comedy might not be for everyone, but if you remember that old cartoon short that became a meme around a decade ago, The Dover Boys I think it was called, if you vibed with that, you'll vibe with Sweet Ermengarde. The two have a very similar sense of humour. I was genuinely shocked to discover H.P. Lovecraft knew how to be funny. I was expecting this story to feel like pulling teeth, but it was actually pretty good. Maybe he was wasted in horror, I guess we'll never know. Either way, Sweet Ermengarde was a lot of fun, and that's why it's getting an A. And that's it. The Book of Cthulhu read, plus Sweet Ermengarde, and here are all the stories ranked. It's nice to be back reviewing books again. I hope you enjoyed watching the video as much as I did making it. If you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it around. It helps the channel out a bunch, and I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, happy Halloween. I'm going to get stuck into the channel update now, so if you're interested, stick around. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Okay, they're gone. I want to thank everyone for your patience again while I took a few months off. I originally wanted to use the time to catch up on the pile because toward the very end of when I stopped, I felt like I was laying the tracks in front of the train as the videos were going up, and it just wasn't fun anymore. Back then I wanted to use the break specifically to read through the Wheel of Time, make all those reviews, and put them up alongside the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which I had incidentally planned to do videos on anyway, even before someone suggested them, which would have given me like another few months to catch up on things, but that didn't happen. Over the break I discovered I would rather jump into a volcano than do any more of those short formulaic reviews. They're just not creatively satisfying anymore, so in order for the channel to continue, there's going to have to be a change. I experimented with a couple of new formats, I tried improvising a video or two, none of it worked, so what I settled on is something like this. It's still scripted, still has the same basic shape as the original formula, but it's much looser and free form. The pros and cons aren't grouped together so rigidly, and there doesn't have to be 3 each. Let me know what you think of the change down below in the comments. Just keep in mind that there's no going back. Another big change is going to be the schedule. I can't keep doing 2 videos a week, so they're going to show up less often, but they are going to be bigger. Instead of doing individual videos of every book I review, I'll probably group them by series, and I'm not going to force myself to read anything I'm not enjoying anymore. If I'm having a bad time, I'm just going to drop it and move on. I'm gonna try and get a video up every few weeks, but it will depend on how long a series it is, and whether or not I enjoy it enough to read through the entire thing, so we'll see how we go. Also, the pile is going to remain closed for recommendations. Never say never, but right now my plans for the channel are to get through the stack of suggestions I already have, and then retire the project. You may know that over the course of 2023, I've found comparatively much greater success on my other channel, focused on gaming critiques, and that's where my attentions have gravitated more and more, because that's what's getting views, and regardless of how much passion you put into anything, it feels good to have it recognised whether the response is positive or negative. That said, working through the pile won't be the only videos coming up on this channel. I'm probably going to alternate reading through the stack of suggestions and stuff I want to read myself, just to give myself a break now and then, and hopefully prevent another burnout. Anyway, there'll probably be a couple of videos in November, so we've all got that to look forward to, but for now, I think that's everything, so I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye everyone.